Enjoy. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the BookGoodies podcast. Today, I'm your host, Deborah Carney, and I am joined today by guests Carla Sarett and Lynne Cantwell. Hi, ladies. How are you?
Pretty good so far. How you doing?
Good. We had a little technical difficulty, so we're running we might sound a little rushed, but we're okay now. Ladies, why don't you start out by introducing yourself to the folks that are listening? Carla, you want to start us off?
Yes, my name's Carla Sarett, and I am a market researcher turned fiction writer, and I started publishing my short stories in literary journals in 2011, and then last year I published my first collection of short stories, and in 2014 another collection, and now I am coming out with a comic novel, a romantic comedy for those of you who follow genre.
Oh, that's lovely. And Lynne, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Lynne Cantwell. I am right now writing urban fantasy and contemporary fantasy. I have a 5-book urban fantasy series called the Pipe Woman Chronicles, urban fantasy, paranormal romance, slice and dice. We can talk about that. And the series I'm working on right now is Land, Sea, Sky. And in my previous life, I was a broadcast journalist for 20 years. So
awesome. You're going to be on the podcast more often. You walk right in.
Well, Lynne and I share a television background because I used to work in television at NBC and then home box office. So
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I used to do journalism research, news audience research.
Oh, okay.
So we have an alliance there.
There we go.
Indeed.
Some commonality of interests.
So I guess I should have said right at the top, which I didn't because I was flummoxed by the technical issues. We're going to talk about genre today. And the reason I wanted to do a podcast about genre is because on the BookGoodies website and on other websites that I run, authors are submitting their books and then they seem to be a little bit confused over genre, and I'm actually a little confused over genre as well. So I'm working on a fantasy book that I'm not quite sure how to classify, so I'm interested in discussing that. And one of the things I want to get out of the way right off the bat is that recently I had an author that tried to list a book as both fiction and nonfiction. And for those of you listening, it should be pretty clear that Carla, you said it best in the pre-show discussion we had. You want to explain how you classified that?
The definition of nonfiction is that it's not fiction. It must be true. So if your book is true, it is by definition not fiction.
Yeah, I mean, that should be pretty clear, but there are people that... and I guess it's people who are mostly covering things like history that, they want a wider audience. So they think that by classifying it as historical fiction instead of just nonfiction is going to get them more readers. But what you're going to end up doing is upsetting people because
it's fraud.
It's fraud.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. Yeah, somebody who picks up a book thinking it's historical fiction and it's going to be, not real characters inserted into fictional or into, true events, they're going to be really surprised if what they've got is, not that at all.
Right.
And not in a good way. They won't be happy about it.
Well, and it's the same thing.
And by the way, Deborah, that's part of what genre is about. You're making a pledge to your reader.
Oh, that's
right.
That's a
You're
really good way to put it.
You're saying, if you buy this book, by my putting it in this genre, I am making a pledge to you that I'm going to respect your reader interests and what you expect from this book. And so, I mean, I think authors do have to think very seriously when they violate those boundaries because they're basically breaking a promise to a reader.
Genre is really a fairly new concept. I think, the 1940s or so? I mean, when we're talking about the whole history of literature, it really began probably after the turn of the 20th century, and not very far into the 20th century, when the bookstores started getting to the point where, you know, they wanted readers to be able to pick the kinds of literature or the kinds of stories that they wanted to read. And so that's when they started classifying the different kinds of fiction in particular, but even nonfiction has genres now. You know, you've got memoir and biography, and then you've also got, history, anything, the Dewey Decimal stuff, Dewey Decimal System or Library of Congress classifications. But those almost aren't genres; they're classifications. I don't know where I'm going with this. Sorry, go.
No, that's okay.
But they serve the same function, Lynn.
Right. If
I say it's a travel narrative and I'm putting it in nonfiction, that's a category. I'm making a pledge to you that when you pick up the book, you're going to get a book about my travels in Africa, and not the travels of an imaginary fantasy witch in Africa.
Right, or you're not going to pick up the book that's supposed to be about travels in Africa, and in fact, it's going to be about, I don't know, arts and crafts of, Canada or something.
That's exactly right. So, I mean, in a sense, it serves the same function.
Right.
Well, and I think that authors need to start understanding that when a reader picks up, like, one of the genres that I think is really misunderstood by authors is paranormal. And Lynn, I know you're writing paranormal fantasy, slice and dice. Can you explain what paranormal actually is?
I think paranormal is probably anything that has to do with like magical creatures. So that would encompass, I don't know, werewolves, vampires, ghosts, fae, any of that kind of shapeshifters. Any of that kind of thing. There's a subset of that, paranormal romance, which usually involves, a relationship between two individuals, one of whom is some kind of magical creature to some degree. So, in my series, I've got a Native American shapeshifter, skinwalker, who ends up as a guardian to the main character, who is a lawyer. But anyway,
nice.
Yeah. It's entertaining. It was fun to write. It was a lot of fun to write. But so that's one definition of paranormal. But we were getting into a discussion on the BookGoodies authors group of where to put vampire novels, and Carla was very adamant that they need to go into horror. I think. Well, no,
I was saying classically they've been under horror, and that's where they sort of began.
Right. Exactly.
I do think that horror fans, horror is really one of the, in terms of short stories and actually getting paid to write fiction, that's actually one of the genres that's still living.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Most short fiction genres have withered away on the vine as paid markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But some of the few stories I've actually gotten money for, believe it or not, I've actually gotten paid, are in the horror genre.
So people are still buying horror. That's interesting.
They're still buying horror. So there are still some genres, and so with paranormal, because I think of it as the reality underneath the everyday reality, and I do love writing paranormal short stories because I love the idea that in everyday life there are these ghosts or these spirits or these magical forces. We're living the life we're living. We're not in Andalusia. We're not in a magical kingdom. Mm-hmm, we're living the life we're living. But beyond this reality, there's another reality. And I think that's it's just a very interesting form to work with. And it does lend itself to a lot of subgenres, like paranormal romance, which I do like. Mm-hmm. Because you can do a lot of literary stuff in that genre. That's a little harder to do when you're doing straight fantasy.
Right. Well, straight fantasy again has a whole bunch of different genres. Paranormal being just one of them. But you've got epic fantasy, which is the classic stuff, Tolkien. And then lately it has morphed into stuff like steampunk, and there has been a lot of cross genre stuff. I can't pronounce the guy's name, but China Mieville, I think is how it's.
Yeah.
who one of my favorite books of his is The City in the City, which is actually sort of a noir detective novel with paranormal overtones. There's not even overtones. It's like there are two cities that are right next to one another, which hopefully this isn't a spoiler for people who haven't read the book, but there are two cities that are right next to one another. In fact, sort of overlap. The alternate universe overlaps, and that's the setting for this book. And part of the thing behind it is that the people in the real world, our real world, which is not the real world of the novel, they'll see occasionally through the veil this other city that is living, that exists in the same frame or like geographical area, I guess, sort of, as their city. But the idea is that you don't pay attention to it. You pretend, you don't acknowledge it. You pretend that it doesn't exist.
Which is one of the overriding premises of paranormal fiction.
Yeah.
That this stuff is actually always around us.
Okay.
Right. And we just don't. Well,
which is very different from classic fantasy, which actually creates whole other worlds.
Right.
That are entirely separate from our everyday reality. When you're reading Tolkien, you're never transported back to your everyday life.
Right.
So I think they actually provide very different psychological benefits to the reader.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I have a question about steampunk, because you mentioned it kind of as fantasy, where I've seen steampunk mostly landing under sci-fi. Is steampunk crossing over into both? And what exactly, what can people expect from steampunk? What is steampunk?
I guess that's true that it's more sci-fi.
It is more sci-fi.
Yeah.
When you look at the magazines that are publishing steampunk,
yeah,
they're mostly the sci-fi magazines. That doesn't mean you won't find a literary magazine doing a steampunk issue.
Right.
But, generally when you're looking at who's publishing steampunk, it's coming from the sci-fi world. Sci-fi, of course, itself is an evolving, morphing
Well,
picture.
That's the thing. And again, it kind of falls under that whole umbrella of speculative fiction. I maybe I'm just weird, but I tend to think of steampunk as being fantasy as much as sci-fi, because you're talking about, you're talking about, when you think of, when I think of science fiction, I think in terms of, the rockets and ray guns kinds of things, the futuristic kinds of things. Steampunk is sort of looking back to an era before ours, where steam was or I guess an alternate universe where steam actually has become the dominant power source, and what authors have done, to develop stories in that kind of universe. So I guess it's sci-fi. I don't know. It's getting to the point, to me anyway, where like I said, there's an awful lot of overlap between sci-fi and fantasy these days, and I like the term speculative fiction more when you're talking about the whole thing, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, even.
Oh yeah, I like the term speculative fiction. It's just that Amazon and the bookstores
don't use it.
True. And there are a lot of magazines. If you go and you're publishing in those genres, you can find magazines that will say, we are looking for speculative fiction. Mm-hmm. And they will list in parens steampunk,
what
soft
they're
sci-fi,
after, actually. Right.
A number of things. But when you go to the bookstores, then they seem to go to these more granular, traditional categories. And I think that's where authors get confused.
Yeah, I know one of the things that we do on BookGoodies, when we ask people, when you submit a book to us, we ask you the main category, and then we ask you to list the genres separately, because I think that that's part of where people are getting confused, and part of where readers want to know exactly what they're getting, where I can't have speculative fiction, steampunk, sci-fi, speculative fiction, fantasy, steampunk. I can't list every single category, because then our category list would be like incredibly out of control. But we can use tags and genres to be able to refine what people are doing. But no, you still can't do fiction and nonfiction on the same book.
Well, from the author's point of view, too, sometimes it's difficult because authors don't really tend to most of the time, we don't tend to sit down and go, I'm going to write a steampunk story, or I'm going to write, a romantic fiction with paranormal, overtones, or romantic story with paranormal overtones, whatever. Mm-hmm. They just have a story they want to tell. Right. And it's after the fact, when you're to the point where you need to start thinking about marketing this thing that you've written, that you have this thing, and now somebody wants you to put it in a category, and you kind of don't know what to do with it in a lot of cases, just because it fits into a whole bunch of stuff, or it kind of doesn't really fit into any of the neat boxes. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's difficult.
I think if you look at the people who've done best in independent publishing, they tend to be very easy to define.
Yeah, Harry Potter.
If you're going to just sort of look at people who are, selling 10,000 books a month.
Well, sure.
And you say, well, why is that happening? Well, one of the reasons it's happening is they're publishing in a very well-defined genre. Yeah. Where there's no ambiguity around the edges.
Right. It's definitely
and so they can very clearly target their book. It's very easy for them to go to all these different websites. And it's something that, I didn't get into writing for the money aspect, which is a good thing.
Yeah, right.
But if I had, if I were sort of to flip it around and if I had studied some of these best cases, and I assume some people listening to the podcast might actually have money in mind, or you never know. I would say, if you really have money in mind, you should define your genre fairly clearly and say, before you finish the book, what genre is this? Who is this target? Where will this appear on these different sites?
Right. And even do even write your plot, your outline in those terms. If you're going to write romance, and romance is a huge, huge market, and sells very well. I mean, if you're really in it for the money, and I've known this for years, if you're really in it for the money, write a romance, follow the formula, stick in your happily ever after, and there you go.
Take it from somebody who didn't do that, yes.
Well, and me too. Thank you. Yeah, exactly.
And again, because I started in literary fiction and publishing in literary fiction journals, my sort of constellation of factors was very different. But, I'm, as a market researcher, able to see sort of best case scenarios and what's working and what's not. And I can see that people who are really performing at those top sales have followed formulas very carefully, and they know in advance where their books fit in.
And you can name them. It's like Hugh Howey. Okay, Wool, that's science fiction. Bella Andre, she writes romance. I mean, it's very cut and dried in those. You're right, Carla. Yeah, I think you're right. So I should probably plan my next series with that in mind.
I mean, it depends again. Right? You have to think about why you're writing and why you're doing this. And there are those of us who are writing for emotional reasons, or for, in my case, irrational reasons.
There's a lot of irrationality going on. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea why I started writing fiction, since I had never had a burgeoning desire to do that. But one day I just started doing that. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to go into this in a purely rational way, genre is where you start.
Yeah.
Because there aren't that many self-published authors who are actually in the literary fiction space.
Well, and do you think that part of the reason that you are pretty good at defining genre and knowing where things need to be, is that because you did write for literary fiction magazines and they gave you feedback as to what they would publish and what they wouldn't?
Well, actually, in a former life, I was a professor.
Okay, that's
so I used to I used to teach some of this. I think, I mean, when you write for literary fiction journals and you use a site like Duotrope Digest, and I subscribe to Duotrope, and you look at all the writing prompts and all the different calls for submission, you become very, very familiar with the different genre silos.
Okay.
And I think that even for people who are not working in short fiction, that's a useful exercise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And
you really
I think
begin to see who's publishing steampunk, who's publishing soft sci-fi, who's publishing paranormal romance, gay romance, all that stuff. You begin to see it. And you can take a look at the look of the magazines and what kind of visual and language they're using to draw readers, and you get a sense of all these different, very fragmented literary worlds out there.
Well, and I think that readers have probably evolved a little bit in the way that now, because everybody isn't going through traditional publishing, I think even in the last 10 years or so is where we've seen a preponderance of these new genres, if you want to, look at them as all being new, is because people are writing what they want to write and not writing what the publishers are accepting. Maybe?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think Amazon has started to subdivide and subdivide its genres in response to what the authors are looking for. I think Amazon has done it purely as a marketing thing, so that you've got your fiction, fantasy, paranormal, shapeshifters and skinwalkers subcategory. I don't think the authors certainly didn't ask for that. And when you go and you upload a book to KDP, to Kindle Direct Publishing, you can't pick shapeshifters and skinwalkers or whatever for your genre. I mean, it's basically fantasy, and then there's some characters, and I think their bots go through the manuscript after that, and then assign the smaller subcategories. So it's not really, I mean, it ends up being to the author's benefit to some degree, because you end up being in a whole bunch of little, smaller lists, and you can kind of play to that when you're marketing your book. But it's really for the readers who are looking for a specific kind of book. Mm-hmm. So anyway,
I find more and more readers today, when you speak with them, and this is sort of the market research part of me, they tend to define their reading interests by topic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Or by type of protagonist rather than by genre. So they're aware of the genre, but they'll say, I like mystery novels in which it's a female detective who has problems.
Right.
That's a very classic way that a reader defines the kind of book she's looking for. So she has a number of authors in mind who write tortured female detectives. But, it's interesting to me that readers have actually gotten very narrow.
Very specific.
Very narrow.
About what they're interested in. Yeah.
They'll actually say, lesbian paranormal romance, or books with, quirky women who have, strange habits, or very often, mystery novels with older female detectives.
Yeah.
That's like a whole category now. Cozy mysteries with older female detectives that take place in rural England.
The cozy mystery.
Yeah,
I think that's Murder, She Wrote, right? That's where that came from.
But there are now, tons and tons of those books. And so what you've gotten is readers coming in with these very, very narrowly defined ideas of what they're looking for, and websites that actually don't correspond to that.
Right. That's one of the reasons why we are trying to build out, and one of the things that brought this whole conversation up is that we have BookGoodies, which is the main huge site, and we put everything up there. But because readers want to be able to find what they're looking for, Carla, like you said, they want to find those cozy mysteries, which I never heard of that until a week ago. I'm like, what is this category on Amazon that's cozy mysteries? Because I'm building a mystery site, right? And on the mystery site, I'm looking through the Amazon categories for mystery, and I had to ask, what is it? And I think it was you guys that, clarified for me what it was. And the reason why I'm building the mystery site is so that people can find the mysteries that they're looking for without having to go digging through Goodreads or Amazon or, even the main BookGoodies site to try and find those very specific types of books that they're looking for. And so that authors have a place to put them where they'll be found.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds great.
But it's confusing. So and there's going to be a lot of crossover between the mystery website is going to have a lot of the same stuff that the romance site is going to have because there's romantic mysteries, right? But you can go to either site and find what you're looking for and then hopefully be able to, go from there and find other authors, or at least find the authors that you're looking for and be able to see. So like you said, Carla, the websites aren't really helping you out. That's something that we're trying to do. So I think it's all part of this evolving publishing, and, readers are driving it. Like in one of the other author groups, someone was saying, oh, there's so much more short books now. And authors are writing shorter books. I'm like, authors are writing shorter books because people want to read something that's shorter and complete because they're sitting at the doctor's office and they want to read while they're in the waiting room. And
but not too short because
correct.
As Carla was saying, there still doesn't seem to be much of a market for short stories. They're looking for novellas,
yes,
or a shorter novel. But so anything over, I don't know, 300-400 pages or so, is really a slog for most people. And
I've actually seen on Goodreads people complaining that a book was too long.
Yes.
I love Dickens, but his books are very long.
I saw an article this week, I think it was on the Washington Post, about how our experiences on the web are changing the way that we read things and the way we process things, to the point where our brains are becoming conditioned to basically hyperlinks, essentially. It used to be you'd sit down with a book and you had the narrative from, page 1 to page whatever, and you just followed, you concentrated on the story. There were no outside distractions, and you just read the story, right? Well, now you go to a web page and there's not just the story that you're reading, but there are links to other stories that are similar, or links to other things you might be interested in, or not even the ads, but it's just the page is very busy.
Yeah.
And so you might, and then there's the additional information, which in a newspaper, say, would be set off in a box to one side where you could sort of glance over going, yeah, well, okay, I'll look at that in a minute. But you could concentrate on the main story. But there are constantly things that are pulling your attention away from the thing that you're looking at right now. And so people are starting to develop neural pathways, basically, that take advantage of this. So it's great for taking in a smattering of information and skimming a lot of different things, but to sit down and read, say, Dickens, anybody who has a really long or really convoluted sentences. Henry Miller, I think, was one of the other suggestions, or one of the other examples. Anybody who has a really convoluted sentence structure with lots of dependent clauses and stuff like that. It's hard for people who read today to wrap their brains around it. It's just almost too difficult, and they really have to force themselves to concentrate. I just thought it was interesting.
That is really interesting. And a lot of, I know myself as a reader, I suffered a concussion a few months ago, and I haven't been able to read the same way since. And Lynn, exactly what you said, I can't read anything that's complex. And Carla, I would rather... I have a
book of flash fiction just for you.
Exactly. I would much rather read...
And by the way, I sell more of that than my traditional short stories.
Well, because it's...
talking about very, very short, I have a book, Crazy Lovebirds, 5 super short stories.
Okay.
That sells pretty well, and people have written me emails saying, I really like the fact that it was really short. Well, that's not a great compliment. as a writer, it's like, oh, they were really short. Thanks.
Well, but it's I know, but it's a different. It's a different technique to write short fiction and write it well, to write super short fiction and write it well.
Than it is to develop. I mean, flash fiction really came about, I think, in the age of the internet, and it, in a sense, is its own genre.
Sure,
and there's
absolutely.
another example of when I recategorized that in Amazon as flash fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
the book started selling.
Really?
Because I really needed to get. I needed to make it clear that that's what it was, because there are people looking for funny flash fiction. Mm-hmm. And, of course, humor is easier to do in very short forms.
Right.
Essentially, you're telling your Shaggy Dog story, yeah.
Let me tell you, it's a lot easier to do.
Well, and I think Lynne brought up a good point, is that, it is very difficult to write short well. Some people write very verbose, and there is no way that they can write something more compact. They just don't know how to trim the words out. So to be able to write short well is a very good skill, and it's something that, people who can do that, then you can target the folks that are looking for it. But don't write short, incomplete, just because you want something that's 1,000 words. Don't just write 1,000 words and then leave them hanging.
We have a feature every
Although
week
that is a separate genre, experimental flash fiction.
Oh, sure.
A lot of the literary magazines do like these highly experimental flash pieces, and literary fiction having its own conventions. You really can't have beginning, middles, and ends in those kinds of pieces where, because I'm not writing experimental literary fiction, I'm allowed to actually tell a whole story in 1,000 words.
Exactly.
Because it actually does have a beginning, middle, and end. Mm-hmm. If you will, a punchline.
Right. What I started to say was I'm contributing author at indiesunlimited.com, and we have a flash fiction contest every week. We put up the prompt on Saturdays, and then on Tuesdays, it's 250 words, so it's really short flash fiction.
Microfiction.
Right. Yeah. So and then on Tuesdays, we put up the vote. So it's a popular vote. Then we pick one winner a week, and then the winning story gets put into an anthology at the end of the year. We've now got 2 anthologies out. But yeah, there are some people that I have read their pieces and gone, there's no end to this. I understand it's only 250 words, but we're not asking you to write a scene. We're asking you to write a story. Right? I mean, it needs to have a beginning, middle, and end still.
This is what happened.
Exactly. It's very interesting.
Well, and I think that a lot of genres have evolved, like memoir. I don't know how long that has really been around as a genre, because before it was always autobiographies and biographies, and I don't remember as a teenager reading many memoirs. It was either autobiography or biography. And now what I like about memoir is that it is stories told throughout someone's life, instead of having to be, I was born, blah, blah, blah. I did this as a teen, and then this is what happened to me as an adult, and this is why I wrote the book. So, I like the idea of, genres having a little more flexibility, or the new genres coming up, because it's more interesting to read, and you're not. I used to read stuff that I used to skip a lot. Herman Wouk, he wrote wonderful, wonderful books, and then there would be entire chapters that were just stuff that I didn't care about, so I would just jump. I'd be like, oh, okay, this is the technical chapter, so I'm just going to skip that because I don't really care. I want to get back to the people.
It's my dirty little secret with Umberto Eco, too. I read The Name of the Rose, and I kept skipping over all the philosophy. It was like, okay, yeah, this is kind of interesting. My eyes are glazing over. Let's move on.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I call it male writer syndrome. I find there are very few female writers where I'm skipping chapters, but I often find in male writers that even among the greats,
That's very interesting.
It is very interesting because I'm thinking
it's kind of a guy thing.
About the
it's like
ones,
it's a guy thing.
I'm thinking about the chapters that I've skipped, and Tom Clancy, Herman Wolfe, Oliver Stone.
Well, Clancy just got to the point where I think his editor was just scared to touch anything.
Yeah,
the longer the books, the later in his career it went, the longer and longer and longer his books got to be. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was just I read the first 2, I think, and I was done. But anyway.
Oh, I read more than that.
You don't have to include that quote.
Yeah, we can leave that part out.
No, I don't edit. But we're talking again about traditionally published authors, and when we have, such a plethora of indie authors, the traditionally published authors, not only do they get their, their editing or not editing, they also get more direction as to how they classify their books, and they also have to stick closer to the formula for whatever genre they're writing in. And some of the authors that we're talking about actually created their own genre. Tom Clancy, wonderful novels, military, espionage, whatever. And he took it a step further than what it had been before him.
Right. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
So
I think that's generally true about genres, but they still have to deliver the primary benefits.
Oh, yeah, totally.
That the reader, I think that you can move plots in some different directions if you deliver the primary benefit that the reader expects from the genre.
Right. You can have a vampire romance or a paranormal romance as long as there's a romance in there and, there's the paranormal part that you're expecting.
Well, I think the author has to think, why is someone, take a mystery? Mm-hmm. Why is someone reading a mystery?
Because they want to try and figure out the puzzle.
They want to see a detective who's clever enough to figure out the crime when no one else can.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they want to see, the rational mind at work. So you can have a lot of different kinds of detectives and a lot of different kinds of crimes. You can even throw some romance in the crime, but you always need to show the detective figuring it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that's what the reader's there for. So I think you have to think about genres in very simple ways in terms of these reader benefits before you get into all these offshoots.
Right.
If you're going to think of yourself as a genre writer.
Well, and then there's the whole romance versus erotica thing. At what
Keep
point?
It clean.
How? At what point does a romance cross over? Oh, I'm not going to discuss specifics. No.
Okay.
But at what point?
You got a nice Jewish girl here. She doesn't do erotica.
Right. But at what point does? We have if you go to a romance site now. And I started a romance site, and there is an erotica category because that's part of what people are looking for. But I'm going to have to start classifying even the books that aren't classified as erotica. You have to look at, are they a clean romance? Are they a kind of, they get into it a little bit romance? How far is that?
What are the quality of the euphemisms that we're, using, and how explicit is it, and what exactly do they do? And I don't envy your job.
The cleanness of it is definitely, needs to be clear to the reader. Mm-hmm. Because there are definitely readers who are looking for romance who really do not want to see anything graphic.
Right.
No interest whatsoever. Yeah.
The Regency crowd, they're not looking for that.
Right.
People are reading, the Duke's cousin.
Yeah. Well, but even some readers of contemporary romance aren't interested in real explicit stuff.
Well, I know with some of my short stories when I share them with writers' critique groups and, asked women about, should I take this scene in a more graphic direction, they said, oh, no, that would be really unromantic.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what I want from this kind of story. I would be really bummed if you introduced that kind of scene into this kind of fiction. So, it's all about your tone. And again, with any given genre, you're going to have those kinds of gradations.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think romance and erotica, used to be erotica was just in a separate silo.
Yeah, and now it's kind of crossing over. And part of the problem is that people when they read it, they expect different things, but also authors aren't really clear how, like you said, they aren't really clear how far they're supposed to go, and like there isn't as much sex in a romance that probably is considered erotica now that wasn't before. So like before you'd pick up an erotica book and you were going to read about sex. Now you can pick up.
I would hope.
Now you can pick up an erotic romance, and it might be a while before they get to the sex part because it's there, but not as much as what it used to be.
Okay.
But I think that part of the thing that authors need to understand is that, there are a lot of readers that still want a clean romance or a not explicit romance, and that, maybe they can get away with one kind of little bit of behind the door sex scene, but not really. And
I think, the very clear way that authors can think about it is to use the example of, primetime network television.
That doesn't work anymore.
No, I'm talking about before 10 o'clock.
Well, even so,
it doesn't work anymore.
I have to tell you that ever since, I'm how many years old? Okay, when I was in college, I kind of pretty much stopped watching TV, and I have not really picked up the habit again, except for when I was in Dallas in the 80s. Okay, so. But since then, if I sit down now and watch primetime TV, and I'm not a prude, but I'm kind of shocked at what's out there. And it's not just the language; it's the sexual situations that they're are just basically a matter of course anymore. So I'm not putting myself out by any stretch of the imagination as a typical reader of romance or whatever.
Still, what I mean is that
there are people
older version,
right? Yeah,
there's still a huge chunk of the reading public.
Mm-hmm. Right.
For different genres, and we'll call them the cozy mystery crowd or the Regency romance crowd, or you can take them in any different genre where they are going to be offended by profanity and graphic sex.
Yeah.
That's not what they're looking for in those genres, and those genres almost exist. If you write a Regency romance and you start introducing different kinds of elements, you're just disappointing your readers.
Right.
Yeah.
So, if you want to write that kind of book, you really should be looking for a different genre.
Right. Or before you classify on a website or wherever, or use the tags on your book on any site that you're putting your book up, you don't want to use the tag Regency romance if your book is borderline erotica.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I download a lot of samples on Amazon, and I personally, for whatever reasons, I don't really like vulgarity or profanity.
Mm-hmm.
And there are enough books by great writers in the world that don't have those things. Mm-hmm. It's a free world.
Right.
I get to read thousands of books, so I can actually pick the books I like. And very often, that's really where I'm going to delete the sample.
Yeah.
Because the premise of the book promised me, a charming, funny satire about something, or, use the word charming, or use all those code words that promise me a certain literary experience.
Right.
Where I'm thinking light, charming entertainment.
Right.
And then I'm confronted with anal sex and profanity.
Right.
And I'm thinking, this is not light or charming.
Didn't exactly deliver what was promised. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. And that to me is a lot of what, the digital environment is about. Because in a bookstore, I would have already done that browsing.
Yes. Yeah, you've got to be true to your book and you look inside the book.
I sift through the book. I'm going to sort of scour that. I'm going to have a lot more probably in the way of reviews going into the bookstore. So I know which books to go to and to avoid. Digitally, I'm probably going to be downloading that sample. Mm-hmm. Or that, look in here. Mm-hmm. And that's usually where I'm going, ding.
Okay, maybe not. Yeah, right.
Well, and, to the other side, you're talking about people looking for light or whatever. If they're looking for horror, they want to be scared.
Yeah.
And if they're looking for mystery, they want to be caught up in a mystery and trying to figure it out, and they don't want to be able to figure it out in the first chapter.
Right.
The whole point of the different genres is to, like you said, give the reader what they're looking for. Don't classify your book as horror just because somebody gets scared in the middle or something. I don't know.
Well, yeah. Or it's just, or it's predominantly, if it's predominantly a romance or, predominantly a fantasy, but you've got a vampire in it and then call it horror. It's not just disappointing the reader. You could actively anger the reader, and that can really come back to
oh, yes.
hurt you later on.
Yeah, I had to change the name of my first story collection.
Okay. Oh, really?
Because I had angered certain people. They wanted traditional romance, and my stories were kind of bummers. They're romantic to me because they have, the themes of haunted love and unrequited love and ghosts obsessed with their past loves. And
you gotta have that happily ever after.
But since almost nobody ended up happy. They were still alive at the end of the story.
You did not fulfill the contract with the reader.
One woman wrote, "I know romance, and this is not romance." And I sort of thought about it. At first I was offended because I thought of romance as Wuthering Heights romance.
Right.
Because to me, that's my model of romance, is impossible haunted love. Mm-hmm. Kathy and Heathcliff on the moors.
I saw that.
That's not really romance.
No. And in fact, I saw Wuthering Heights reclassified by somebody not too long ago as, what was it? Was it paranormal or something?
Yes. The truth is that I realized that I was writing more metaphysical fiction or paranormal, or as I explained to Lynne before, that I had mixed up genres, which is a no-no, and I will never do again. Mm-hmm. But again, my model of romance, when I thought of the most romantic book I'd ever read,
it was Wuthering Heights.
Wuthering Heights. I think that's you can't get more romantic than Heathcliff on the moors, the wind, and, but of course that's not what the romance genre is at all.
That's not what people want, yeah.
Right.
Well, and so, of course, I'd broken the pledge, and then, I sort of changed the name and the description.
Well, and the other genre that I think is, or top-level classification that I think is really misunderstood is young adult.
Oh, yes.
At least there's new adult, which, that takes the young adult that was bordering on having sex that shouldn't be in young adult at all, in my opinion. If I were to read a young adult book, I wouldn't expect there to be sex in there. So, at least they started the new adult category or genre or whatever you want to call it, that people are starting to write. So at least they're being honest. But to me, a young adult story is a story that appeals to teenagers to read, where now I'm hearing that it is only if there are teenagers that are the main character in the book.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, that's essentially it. And I think what happened was the reason that they had to kind of separate this and start the new adult category was because people were seeing YA books sell very well. Mm-hmm. And when you have the Harry Potter and the Hunger Games and Twilight, and these books are making money hand over fist, and people are like, well, I'll just write a book and I'll call it YA, and then we'll just we'll make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And without really fully understanding the conventions of the genre, and what people expect, what the readers expect out of it. I mean, there are a lot of adults who read YA,
right?
Lots and lots of adults who read it and really like it. I read the Harry Potter books, and by and large, I liked them a lot.
Well, books with teenage protagonists are a big part of American literature. If you think of Huck Finn,
mm-hmm. Well, sure,
or Catch on the Rise. So, YA has, character, the description of kind of teenage characters and that told from the teenager point of view has always been like a big part of literature. So siloing it out is a little funky in the first place. Of course, there are going to be adults who are going to be reading Lord of the Flies. I mean, because a lot of classic YA literature was written, it's from the perspective of the teen, but it's definitely
adult.
It's literature.
And it was never classified as YA. YA is really a new thing. I mean, it has only been, again, this whole thing with genres really starting within the last, 100 years or so. But really, YA is even newer than that. It's within, the last 20 or so, when people were authors, publishers, really started targeting this young demographic of book buyers. And saying, well, we've got a kid who's the protagonist here. We'll make this book YA. It's a fairly new thing, really.
I think it's important for independent writers because I think the younger readers are much less interested in whether something is traditionally published.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Very true.
It means nothing to them. If they see something in a genre with a cool title and a cool cover, they're not interested in whether it was reviewed in the New York Times.
No, and I think by and large most readers don't care either. I mean, I've yet to meet anybody who has bought a book based on the imprint, based on who published the thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, they don't care.
Well, I sort of disagree with you because I know a lot of people who buy books because of reviews in major magazines. They're buying books based on a review in the New York Times or a review in the New Yorker or a review even in Publishers Weekly. And independents, by and large, can't get into those venues, so they're excluded from the mindset, the purchase consideration set, even when they're writing in genres that could interest those people.
Right. Yeah. But they're not picking those books specifically because they're published by a traditional publisher. That's not the criteria. The criteria is, I read this review. It sounds like a really interesting book. I'd really like to read that.
Yes.
So
they're not saying, it's published by Farrar. I'll go buy it.
Exactly. But or, Random Penguin.
It wouldn't get reviewed if it weren't published by Farrar.
Well, right. So then the challenge for indies is to figure out a way to break into, to get into that ecosystem where where the people who review these books, Publishers Weekly, New York Times, whatever, begin to consider indies, the good books, as being worth their time and being worth a review.
You know what?
I don't know how to do that.
I need to disagree right here because I'm going to tell you that I haven't been an avid reader the last, let's say, 10 years, but up until then, my teen years and my 20s and when I was raising my kids, I was an avid reader, and I picked my books by looking at them in the bookstore. I didn't care if they were reviewed by the New York Times. I didn't care if they were on the bestseller list. I didn't care about anything except that this book was something that I picked up, and I liked the blurb on the back because it told me about a story that I wanted to read, and I flipped through the book to see what was in the book. Whether it was reviewed by anybody or in a literary magazine or anything like that, couldn't care less.
So you were,
but that was before this new environment. So everything that you were looking at had been pre-screened by a bookstore along those dimensions.
Well, okay, but how are the bookstores getting the books? The bookstores are getting the books because the reps from the publisher come in with their catalogs.
So, I mean, that was a different system, really a different ecosystem.
Even now,
I'm not saying this is all readers. I'm saying there's a chunk of readers.
Oh, there are definitely a chunk.
Absolutely.
But I have to say that I think that authors are spending a little too much time on. I think they need to pay more attention to other aspects of their work and not worry about getting into Publishers Weekly. I think that'll come in time when there are fewer books that are being traditionally published, and those places have to come out.
And when Publishers Weekly stops charging indies for writing a review of their books as much,
right,
when they give them to traditionally published authors for free,
right,
through the publisher.
Yeah,
I mean it's a.
But I think
it's very interesting.
Yeah, I think that like the whole subject that we're talking about is that authors need to be true to their audience. And by being true to your audience and being honest in your genre, your tags, in your book blurb, and how you present your book, I think that's how you're going to be more successful. And I think readers are going to be very grateful to authors that, I think you said it earlier, Lynn, that they delivered on the contract that, the reader expected them to.
Yeah.
So
going back to whether or not you pick a book from a review, I really didn't start paying attention to reviews until really, the serious reviews and the serious review places, until I was in grad school for creative writing. And that was one of the things that, and I'm stumbling over myself, sorry. But one of the criteria for really good books, as Carla was saying, was one of the criteria for really good books is to get a review in one of these places. Oh, so this is a book that's worthy of my time. Before that, yeah, I was exactly where Deborah is. I would go to the bookstore, pick up a book. That looks interesting. Flip through it and see if it interests me.
Which is my point about YA, is that those younger readers, there are no younger readers who are looking for book reviews. Once you get into the older set, then you still have a chunk of the public that's looking for bestseller lists or looking for reviews or looking for mainstream sources. But the younger market is really wide open for independence. And it seems to me, of the genres, it's probably the most fertile ground for selling.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the kids, though, is that who's paying for the books and who is... so you're also sort of appealing to getting the interest or the attention of the parents who are paying for the books for kids in, I don't know, middle school or something, who may not have their own disposable income or not as much as you might think. And that's the interesting thing with e-readers, too. How much are the kids spending on getting these books? And where's the money coming from? So you sort of have to appeal to the parents as well, to some degree, at least for the younger kids.
Well, and there are parents who are going to go out and buy a specific series for their kids because they read it when they were kids.
Right, absolutely. Although my kids really weren't interested in Nancy Drew at all. I read a lot of Nancy Drew, but my kids are in their 20s now. But I read a lot of Nancy Drew when I was a kid, okay? And then when they got to be the age, I was like, Nancy Drew! And they're like, these are really kind of not very good, Mom. Okay. No, but they were into Tamara Pierce, who is fabulous, by the way, as a YA author. She's great.
Well, and I think another thing, too, that defines possibly, YA more than others is what are kids exposed to by the time they start reading. So Nancy Drew was great for us.
Completely different now, absolutely.
Now kids are like, okay, I know that story.
Yeah.
This story is something that I've heard, I've seen it on TV, it's predictable because current stuff has built upon the stories that were told back then.
Right. Yeah, well, then they're also kind of squeaky clean compared to some of the other stuff. They don't really, tackle difficult subjects. Mm-hmm. The stories really kind of aren't very well written, which I'm seeing now.
Formulaic.
Absolutely.
But, certain formulas do really well. Like you said, a romance book written to a formula, it's going to sell off the shelves, whether it's really well written or whether it just fulfills what the reader was looking for. It was a 99-cent, I want something to read quick.
This one looks good.
Yep, this one looks good.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Well, I think this has been a very interesting discussion. Carla, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave people with as far as genre?
I think you could learn from my error as a short story writer, which is don't blend genres. Don't make the mistake of thinking that people want a mix of things. Mm-hmm. Be clear. I took the advice in putting together a short story collection. Rather than following my own instinct and doing only one type of story, I blended different genres together. Mm-hmm. And that turns out to be a bad thing to do. So
at least in terms of selling books, yeah.
In terms of selling books, people read the book like the book, but it's really a bad way to sell because you really now have confused readers. They're not sure what benefit they're going to be getting. Mm-hmm. So don't blend your genre as much as possible when you're positioning your book. Pick a genre and be very clear to your reader what it is. And as you're writing it, also be clear that you're delivering the benefits of at least one genre.
Okay.
So that's what I would.
That's awesome. And Lynn?
I think it's going to be very interesting over the next few years to see where this whole thing with genre goes. We've been talking about how the publishing companies started to institute this thing, this concept of different kinds of books to help the authors, and now it's gotten to the point, as we were talking about in Amazon, with the categories are getting more and more narrow as time goes on. And I wonder whether we're going to max out with the amount of narrowness to some of these categories, and we may end up pulling back. I don't know. It'll be fun to watch, and I'm going to be taking Carla's advice to heart and not mixing my categories and try to write something that delivers on the promise, and so that the readers get what they're paying for.
That's a great way to put it. Carla, where can people find you on the web?
Well, I do have a blog, Carla Sarett at Blogspot, and go to my Amazon page as well, and I'm on Goodreads.
Okay, can you, because some of the people are going to be listening to this and they aren't going to be landing on our page that's going to have your name on it. Can you quickly spell out your name so people can look for you? CarlaSarett. Cool. And Lynn?
And if you Google that, you will get to my blog.
Awesome. It's always great when that happens, isn't it?
It's really awesome. These people wandering off the street. My name is Lynne Cantwell, LYNNE CANTWELL. My blog is Hearthmyth, HERTH-MYTH. .blogspot.com. And I'm also on Amazon and on Goodreads, and I got a Facebook page, which is if you Google or if you look up Lynne Cantwell on Facebook, you will find me.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank both of you for spending an hour or so with myself and with our listeners. And I want to invite all of our listeners to come on over to BookGoodies.com, do a quick search for the podcast title, and you will find the podcast, and you can leave us your thoughts about genre and how you buy books and whether certain genres are not filling what you as a reader think they should be. So come on over to BookGoodies.com, BookGoodies.com, and thanks for listening, and everybody have a great day.